My name is Victor Fuhrman. Some call me The Voice. I've always been fascinated with human nature, spirituality, science, and the crossroads at which they meet. Join me now and we will explore these topics and so much more with fascinating guests, authors, and experts who will guide us to Destination Unlimited. Regular listeners to Destination Unlimited have heard me discuss my childhood in the 1950s and 60s and my fascination with both science and spirituality. When I was 13, an uncle who was also a mystic gave me a copy of a book entitled Worlds in Collision. Written by independent scholar and psychoanalyst Immanuel Velikovsky, the book, based upon comparative mythology, postulated that around 1500 BCE, the planet that we know as Venus was ejected from Jupiter as a comet-like object. Transiting close to Earth, he speculated that it affected our world's axis and orbit, resulting in the catastrophes documented in early mythologies and religions. His thesis was rejected by the scientific community, but led to a fascination with what actually happened that caused disparate cultures from around the world to share stories with common themes. In 1976, Zecharia Sitchin published a book entitled The 12th Planet, the first in a series of books sharing his thesis that human origins were the result of ancient astronauts visiting the Earth. He attributed the creation of the ancient Sumerian culture to the Anunnaki, a race of extraterrestrials from a planet beyond Neptune called Nibiru. His work was based upon interpretations of Sumerian texts and also comparative mythology. His work was also criticized by mainstream science, especially astronomers, until his death in 2010. In 2016, the American Astronomical Society published a study in its journal and said there may be a giant distant planet in the Kuiper Belt that would make it the 9th planet. Could this correspond with the planet in Sitchin's theory? Might there be some truth in his thesis that would explain the similarities in ancient myths? Returning to join me on Destination Unlimited this week is author, historian, and renegade archaeologist Dr. Heather Lynn. A professor of humanities by day and an ardent truth seeker by night, Heather is on a mission to uncover and share the lost wisdom of antiquity, challenging the accepted narrative found in our history books. Author of multiple books and articles on fringe topics ranging from history to philosophy, Heather's research includes hidden history, ancient mysteries, mythology, the occult, symbolism, paleocontact, and consciousness. Her website is drheatherlynn.com, and she joins me this week to discuss her latest book, The Anunnaki Connection, Sumerian Gods, Alien DNA, and the Fate of Humanity. Please join me in welcoming back to Destination Unlimited Dr. Heather Lynn. Good evening, Heather.
Good evening. Thank you so much for having me.
And it's so wonderful to have you back. It's been a couple of years since we had you on the last time, and it's great to have you back. For our listeners who are meeting you for the first time, please share your path and how it led to you becoming a renegade archaeologist.
Oh, well, it was a bumpy road. It wasn't a smooth path in the least, but it was pretty conventional. I mean, I went to school to study. Well, initially it was just business because I thought I was going to be responsible and do something just, the right thing. I didn't dare follow my dreams or anything. So, but the more I took classes, the voluntary classes like art history, and I thought, I can't do this. I can't take this business course and then do something that I don't love just for the sake of doing it. So, I just followed my passion, and but I started at a community college, which, is a very important part of my journey. I really think that experience shaped how I looked at a lot of different things. I didn't come from that sort of background where it was expected that I go to college and then it was paid for and then I floated on by. It was not that way at all. I actually left school when I was 15, 16 years old. I started, running around the country doing other things. So I'm actually a high school dropout. And I went back to community college and started there. And so I started looking at archaeology and these other subjects, and I always had a fascination with these ancient civilizations and some of these mysteries. I think it really had to do with, well, I had an interest in it when I was a child, of course, but I think something that really led me to look at the alternative aspect of it was time I spent living in my car, and I had nothing but late night radio to get me through the evenings, and I found it to be so fascinating. And I was traveling the country, and I was stopping and meeting people in different areas and talking to a lot of different people and hearing their stories of, contact and their sightings, and I just fell in love with the whole topic altogether. And so, but it wouldn't be for much longer until I actually went back to school. But, I went and transferred to the regular 4-year and just sort of found myself, as some would say, a career student, and finished my master's in history and then went on for my doctorate. And, so it became just, a path that is more like a journey. And along the way, I had a lot of interesting experiences that had me questioning whether or not the world I was involved with in academia was all that it had presented itself to be. So I found a lot of different, examples of corruption, things you would expect to find in any organization or institution. But, I just was dismayed in a lot of ways at the lack of passion and enthusiasm and creative thinking in the academy, and a lot of the, for lack of a better word, cover up over a lot of different subjects. And I use the example. I like to tell people the story of when I had my first archaeology class, and I went into the classroom, and the very first day we had on the board different authors that were, the names were listed, and it was authors I was very familiar with from listening to late night radio and reading these sort of books like the ones you mentioned at the intro. And the whole purpose of the listing of these authors was we were supposed to pick one of these authors and write a paper to debunk one of their theories. And I mean, clearly the Sitchin and others could be something controversial that, at first glance you could easily dismiss, but it didn't just include those sort of, out there or risk-taking authors. It also had a lot of other just kind of what I would have considered more mainstream, like Robert Schoch. And so I thought that was interesting, but, I was still not suspicious. I just thought, okay, well, but I was a little concerned as to why before we had even cracked the book or learned anything that we were expected to give some sort of cogent argument against these theories that we weren't even familiar with. And so it was brought up, though, as the lecture went on, and the reason was, and the basic premise of the whole lecture was about how important it is to protect the reputation of the establishment, and that would be one of the most important things we would do in our careers, aside from the research and the work and publishing, et cetera, but that it is first and foremost important to protect the interest of the, discipline itself, which I thought, okay. But, I still stayed through and just dealt with it. But after a while, I got a little disenchanted with just the overall attitude of everything. I was working as an archaeology teaching assistant and a researcher, and I worked in the lab. And, I got in the mix with a lot of the people involved in running things financially, and I just couldn't believe the sort of waste and abuse. And it was just, and this was on a small scale. And so later I found out how big it actually got with much bigger institutions and governments and this sort of thing. But I mean, that's a story for another day. But yeah, so I decided, should I keep going or should I pull back and do something different? And I actually reached out to Michael Cremo, the author of Forbidden Archaeology, and as an undergraduate still, and asked him this very thing. What do I do? Do I stick with this, or should I just start writing a book right now? And thankfully, he talked me off the ledge. He didn't advise me either way. He was very careful to just give me very good advice and leave that decision up to me. But he said, essentially, if I stayed in the academy, I could make a change, do some good work, but I could only push the envelope a little bit within the system. Yeah. If I left, I could really have a lot of freedom and, push the envelope even further, but I would be lacking, some of the benefits of that education and credibility, no less. And so I thought, okay, well, I guess what I'll do is I'll stick with it and maybe be a double agent, if you will. And so I just did my time. And as soon as I was out, I, started doing my own thing. Now, since I have returned to, higher education, but I did so as a community college professor by design so that I could give back to students who are very motivated to learning. And it's something that was a personal pursuit for me, that as well as professional. But so I do that in the daytime, and in the evenings, and on my other time, if you will, I go full force into these fringe topics and do what I can to enlighten other people with my research and whatnot. So it's pretty much all I have about me. That's
wonderful. I mean, that's you are the renegade. You are not willing to stand by the status quo, and you're also not willing to accept nonsense, but you're willing to research and find the answers, and that's a beautiful thing.
Thanks. I don't like talking about myself, but I know people need to know who I am. I like to try to focus on the work, but that's me.
We have about a minute or so in the segment. Last time you were on, you discussed your book, Evil Archaeology. Just give our listeners a gist of that book, please.
Oh, Evil Archaeology is basically an overview of the historical and archaeological record, looking for artifacts and evidence of evil entities and understanding how demons from the ancient world could actually have an impact on our lives today. But I look at the history and lore behind real relics that were believed to be haunted, and I show historical accounts of demons and possession as far back as King Solomon. And it's I'm really happy with how this book turned out, but it is a little scary. I always try to warn everybody about that, but it is all based in fact, and it's not meant to scare anyone, just inform. But there is a lot of good and hopeful information in it too about what you can do to protect yourself from these evil entities, at least historically, what people traditionally have done to do so.
And for our listeners who either saw the movie The Exorcist or read the book The Exorcist, and they talk about Bezuzu was a real zoo.
Yes, absolutely. It was, and that is the demon that is depicted on the cover of the book. And part of the motivation, or inspiration rather, for me to write the book in the first place was a fascination with that connection between our pop cultural ideas of what demons are and how they look, and what the historical record actually says.
And that book was called Evil Archaeology. Her new book, which we'll be talking about soon, is The Anunnaki Connection, Sumerian Gods, Alien DNA, and the Fate of Humanity. We'll be back with Heather Lynn after these words on the OMTimes Radio Network.
OMTimes Magazine is one of the leading online content providers of positivity, wellness, and personal empowerment. A philanthropic organization, their net proceeds are funneled to support worldwide charity initiatives via Humanity Healing International. Through their commitment to creating community and providing conscious content, they aspire to uplift humanity on a global scale. OMTimes, co-creating a more conscious lifestyle.
A social distancing tip.
Putting distance between yourself and others is critical to slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are ways to stay in contact without the physical contact part. Call, send a text, set up a video conference, post on social media, dedicate a song on the radio. If you have symptoms of fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going to their office. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Back on Destination Unlimited, my guest this evening is Dr. Heather Lynn. She's the author of The Anunnaki Connection, Sumerian Gods, Alien DNA, and the Fate of Humanity. Heather, before we begin with the book, I have a question for you. As a historian, do you think that the current COVID-19 pandemic will dramatically change civilization as we know it?
Without a doubt. The question is going to be in what ways, and I think that has yet to be seen only because we don't know the extent of the damage, so to speak. So, for instance, during the time of the Black Death, you would have seen a tremendous amount of death and destruction, that sort of thing. Well, as a result, most of the labor force died, and this left a lot of work to be done, and so it drove wages way up. And it also made it so that property was distributed differently. And so it led to what we know now as the modern era, but that was sort of the opening of that, where we had the early modern period develop shortly after. But it really was because of the loss of human life. It was so immense that the wealthy landowners had nobody to work their land. They didn't, they were going to suffer and lose. And so as a result, the people at the time were able to say, well, yeah, sure, I'll work here, but under these circumstances. And they really, it changed the power dynamic extensively. And surely after time that, led to this modern era with a host of other things contributing, of course. But that was really, the point that everything turned. And so that's, for that example. So in this case, let's hope that we don't have any more loss of human life. We've already had so much as it is, but if something like that were to happen, it would definitely cause an economic shift that would be possibly beneficial for people in lower paying jobs. But, really that with the question of automation, that's something to question as well. It's a sort of a path we don't really know because of the technologies that we have that they didn't have historically. But aside from those practical or economic situations, as far as spiritual transformation or cultural changes, absolutely. Now, my fear or concern, if you will, is that it's going to drive people to be more disconnected socially. If we've been told to social distance for so long, and we're also looking at people in this manner of, we have to stay away from them because they could be ill. They could make us ill. This kind of mindset, if it plays our most basic evolutionary programming of the disgust factor, which is something that is pretty well established in the literature, but it's something that also people don't want to discuss a lot because it can sometimes argue reasoning for things like inequalities or racism or xenophobia. But this idea that in evolutionary biology, we're programmed with a disgust factor, so that when we see somebody maybe not like us, we're a little more we're a little less likely to want to interact with them. We're a little more cautious. And that is, a result of this disgust factor where it's sort of a protective mechanism because we don't know what diseases people would have. Now, obviously, that is like a vestigial tail or something we don't really need right now because we have minds. We're not just animals. We can see someone who maybe has, a different feature or they're somehow different than us visually. And we can say, oh, that's just what that is. And so most of us are able to not be run by those base instincts, but some, it still has an effect. And in some ways it affects the way we look at things. And so my concern is that even the best laid intentions, even if we think we're so much more evolved, if we have this subconscious messaging that the other, whoever it may be, our neighbors, our friends, somebody other than our immediate tribe is somehow tainted in such a way they could make us ill, that could very much lead to, us easing back into that baseline behavioral pattern of just going, oh, I don't want to be near people, or having a disgust factor. And why, that can be dangerous is because it does lead to, hate and divisiveness. And it can also then lead to things like we saw in, the Second World War and other wars, of course, but most notably with the Nazis, where we're able to look at a group of people and say, ew, they're not like us. In fact, they're not human, and then call them vermin or pests. And what do you do with those sorts of things? You want to eradicate them and so on and so forth. And so it could lead to something disastrous like, war and violence and this sort of us versus them mentality, however that may be. And so, it's a huge can of worms that could happen. And so that's very pessimistic, but those are the things that I'm concerned with. Now, on the flip side, there are a lot of things that could come out of this, for the better, like time spent with family or, we might appreciate things a little more. We might appreciate nature more because we've been pent up for so long. We may appreciate the little things. We may appreciate, like we have been, people who do essential work, people who do low-paying jobs that are vital to our everyday lives, like food service or supply chain or these sorts of things, truckers. So my hope is that positive things will come about as a result of this, and they probably will. But historically, there have been very dangerous consequences to big, impactful events such as pandemics. But it's so far out to speculate, only because we don't have the complete picture of the data. But all I can say for absolute sure is that this will be a substantial change on our way of life, our way of thinking about things, and our everyday life, and then plans moving forward. This is a pinnacle moment for humanity, and we can only hope and pray that things don't go for the worse, but maybe something positive can come out of this. It has yet to be seen.
I have always been what they used to call a cockeyed optimist. And it is my fervent hope and prayer that we come out on the other side of this with more compassion for one another, with more kindness for one another, with a greater appreciation of everything that we have. I think as especially as Americans, we've lost sight the fact that 70% of the world doesn't live like we live. And I think having this time of physical separation, isolation, of having to give up a lot of the conveniences and the things that we take for granted will give us a greater appreciation for everything that we have, including our planet, Mother Nature, and everything around us. So, yeah. That's my prayer and hope, too. Now, let's talking about the Anunnaki connection. Author Christopher Vogler said, "A myth is a metaphor for a mystery beyond human comprehension. It's a comparison that helps us understand, by analogy, some aspect of our mysterious selves. A myth in this way of thinking is not an untruth, but a way of reaching a profound truth." Now, in the beginning, I shared the work of Velikovsky, and it was based upon comparative mythology, even if his hard science was not there. But was he initially on the right track?
I think so. I think that is, I think people like him, people like Sitchin, are an important part of the discovery process itself. It's like, these are things that happen. Like, I give the example of Newton. Isaac Newton is looked at as the father of modern science, and rightfully so. He was so far ahead of his time. But while people look at him as this, very rational scientific person, who is just to be lauded as such, they conveniently forget or leave out, or maybe don't even know, that a lot of his time was spent doing things that would be scoffed at, and that even he had to hide in a lot of ways from the power structure in his day. So, for instance, he was very much interested in alchemy. He was interested in astrology, and very, very interested in biblical interpretations, particularly with trying to figure out the date of the end of the world, and a whole host of occult and esoteric practices. And many of his writings were on these subjects, and he did a lot of work in that area. But those things are looked at as, well, they're not even looked at a lot of times. You just look at Newton as just this father of science. Well, likewise, not to compare, everybody to somebody like Isaac Newton, but I think in a lot of ways the comparison is valid, in that you have people who are interested in these offbeat subjects, and they allow themselves the ability to think outside the box for, lack of, I don't mean to be cliche, but that's essentially what they do, is they think above and beyond, and they let their minds explore all the possibilities, and they're not boxed in by the scientific method until they are. And then that's when they can start working those things out, and other people start doing that as well. So I think a place that they inhabit is an important part of the process of the scientific method. It's sort of the beginnings, the stirrings. It's the chaos before the order. And it's essential to that methodology. Otherwise, I think what you start getting is what we have now, a lot of just derivative work that is a regurgitation of the reports before and the studies before. And while science in that method, it has to be, these experiments have to be repeated or these ideas have to be replicated in order for them to be established as legitimate, there is a difference between replication and regurgitation. And if you look into a lot of the academic databases, the articles and the studies that are being put out right now are they're hardly original. There's nothing to them. And so I think that's, a part of the overall broken part of, academia itself. And so when you have authors like, Sitchin or even von Daniken, you see the beginnings of this unhindered thinking. And then what they do, because they're not irrational, erratic people, they start working those theories out. And a lot of people have a problem with that because, they push the limit of that process. But I think it's a very important and healthy part of creativity and discourse. So that's kind of where I stand on that.
Absolutely. In fact, quantum mechanics, quantum physics is changing the way we think about a lot of things right now. And 25 years ago or 20 years ago, that would have been called science fiction, or they would have said crazy or something of that nature. But my guest is Heather Lynn. She's the author of The Anunnaki Connection, Sumerian Gods, Alien DNA, and the Fate of Humanity. Heather, please tell our listeners where they can get your book and find out more about you and your work.
Well, you can go to my website at drheatherlynn.com and you'll find links to everything there. But I'm also, all my books are available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, indie bookstores. There's also audiobooks, so you can get those through Audible. But yeah, anywhere books are sold.
And we'll be back with more of Heather and the Anunnaki Connection after these words on the OMTimes Radio Network.
This is OTR-FM, part of the IOM Radio Network.
Humanity Healing International is a small nonprofit with a big dream. Since 2007, HHI has been working tirelessly to bring help to communities with little or no hope. Our projects are not broad mandates, nor are they overnight solutions, but they bring the reassurance that no one is alone and that someone cares. To learn more, please visit humanityhealing.org. Humanity Healing is where your heart is.
Hello, I'm Lisa Berry. Join me every Monday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for Light on Living. A chance to see new, hear different, and feel more as I shine the spotlight on all the ways to lighten the load of life's challenges. Light on Living is your link to that new way you're looking for, that new understanding that will enhance your life, and that positive connection that will support your growth. So join me and you'll gain insight and start to see things in a new way that motivates you.
So I'm a cat, and I just moved in with this new human, and she's got this little toy she's always playing with, all day long. Tap, 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 bloop, bloop. She can't put it down. There it is. Oh, and get this. She even talks to it. Last week she asked it for Chinese, and guess what? Egg rolls showed up. Like magic. Humans have cool toys.
A person is the best thing to happen to a shelter pet. Be that person. Adopt. Brought to you by the Ad Council and the ShelterPetProject.org.
Why should you volunteer with Meals on Wheels?
I'll come to the door with one meal and I'll walk away with a full heart.
Drop off a warm meal and get more than you expect. Volunteer at americaletsdolunch.org. Brought to you by Meals on Wheels America and the Ad Council.
A social distancing tip.
While the CDC urges you to avoid close contact, like hugging or shaking hands, there are other non-physical ways to say hello. Wave, wink, use sign language, salute, smile, give the peace sign, throw up an air high five, do jazz hands. Remember, stay a minimum of 6 feet or 2 arms length away from others and stay home if you can. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part because we're all #alone together. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Back on Destination Unlimited, my guest this evening, Dr. Heather Lynn. She's the author of The Anunnaki Connection, Sumerian Gods, Alien DNA, and the Fate of Humanity. Heather, what led to your interest in researching ancient Sumer and the Anunnaki?
Well, I think I sort of fell into it. I was interested in it casually. But, I think I was interested in just ancient civilizations in general. But the more I started looking into some of these theories, the more I thought, oh, isn't this interesting? And again, it's my part of the reason I believe that the alternative thinkers and authors are also very important, because they draw people in with this creative thought process. And it leads people, hopefully, to start researching things and contributing and maybe, finding their own way through that research. And so that's kind of what I did. I started looking at this information just casually, and it was a lot of fun. But then I started recognizing particular themes and ideas that really resonated and made sense in the context of comparative mythology, comparative religion, and history. And I thought, wait a second, there may be something to this. And so I looked into it a little further, and then it just so happened that in 2013, I was looking into a particular news story about an archaeological excavation that was going on in Iraq at the time. It was a very important excavation, and so somebody had reached out from the area and told me about it, and I looked into it, and I couldn't find a lot of information, so I contacted the university to ask them if I would be able to have an interview with the lead anthropologist, and they said yes, and that would be fine, and we arranged it, and they asked me if I could submit the questions I had intended on asking beforehand, and so I did, and then they ghosted me completely, and I wasn't able to talk to anybody, and that just led me to be very curious, and so I started researching things further and found that there were a lot of nefarious players in this, which I thought was very unusual. Like, well, why is this so controversial? And so it was this particular excavation was being funded by big oil companies, which I thought really didn't make any sense. And then there were some conflicts of interest in terms of the individuals who were the donors. So Baron von Thyssen from the Thyssen family dynasty, whose family was known as being the top financiers for the Nazi Party, and but who he, in particular, is known as one of the world's leading collector and sellers of antiquities, which I thought was definitely a conflict of interest, especially he was so blatant in saying, oh, he just loves being able to buy these things or have these things. And so, that was odd. And I found out that the money was being laundered, through, different means. It was, the money was coming from these particular groups, but then it was going to different foundations, which would then be broken up and then sent to the university, who would then break it up further to be sent to the departments and so on and so forth. So that there was just a silo effect of plausible deniability. And so the archaeologists on the ground, they were just collecting their paychecks. They didn't really have anything to do with this. But what was going on was at the very top, there was a lot of, funny business. And it really just got me when I found out that the site reports, before they could be released to the public, were first given to the members of the board from the oil company in private. And I thought, wait a minute, who are you answering to? Big corporations or the public trust? And why this? Why this material? Why the Sumerian texts? That got me even more curious. And so I just stumbled into it, and I went down a rabbit hole. And I thought, why is this so intriguing to a lot of people? And I guess my journey just started there, and I have been interested then in sort of the idea of discarnate entities ever since, because that was the theme that had come up in my research over and over again when I started looking at, the obvious things that were fascinating, like pottery or artifacts or, architecture, or all of these things. Yes, they're very fascinating. There's so much we can learn about the material, from the material culture. But this undercurrent always was this idea of otherworldly entities. And, I think that just kept my interest, and it continues to keep my interest.
Tell us a little about Zecharia Sitchin.
Well, Sitchin has been known as a divisive figure. But according to Sitchin, who had published, he was originally an economic historian, and much like I was, and in a lot of my discipline, and he was very interested in these texts, and so he spoke Hebrew, and used his knowledge of Hebrew to try to understand the Sumerian text, and he was fascinated with this subject, and spent a good deal of his life devoted to trying to understand these texts. In doing so, he came up with this very intriguing theory that there was this, I guess, for lack of a better word, maybe a cosmic egg that was the concentrated atomic mass that exploded after reaching like a destiny limit about 15 billion years ago. I mean, he starts his thoughts out very long, but it kind of matches the Velikovsky story. They sort of go hand in hand in a lot of ways. But fast forward that into, I guess, the parts that people are most intrigued with is this idea that these gravitational forces and these bursts drew in a planet that was called Nibiru, that traveled in the solar system and below the elliptical, passing through the orbits of Neptune and Uranus. And so the why this is important to the story is that he believed that the ancient texts described Nibiru as being the source of the gods of the Sumerians. This is where they live. The Sumerians, live there. The Anunnaki lived there rather, and then came here. But he has this whole account that this planet was the home planet for people who were described as being a race of gods, and who now we know as the Anunnaki. But that these gods visited Earth in the past and influenced human culture. Not only influenced it, but actually genetically manipulated the animals and subsequently the humans. And so, but he has this very big theory that I do go into in the book, but something that I found that was really important was to present his work as fairly as I could, but also not take one side or the other exclusively. And some people have said, oh, well, it's very wishy-washy. But I'm not trying to be wishy-washy when I do this. I have a very kind of, strong opinion on this whole take. And I think it could be encapsulated by one of the readers or potential readers I had contacting me, asking me if this new book that I had out was going to take the enslaving humans to mine gold approach, which was sort of the thesis of Sitchin, where the Anunnaki gods came from Nibiru and not only genetically engineered people, but enslaved them in order to have those workers mine gold that they would be able to have back to their home planet. And so this is the theory. Or they asked me, do I take the enslaving humans for agriculture side? And so this is the thing, is that I don't believe that in a topic so big and complex that we can take sides given the amount of developing information. And so what you see a lot of time now is that there are, believers and non-believers, and this gap is starting to widen. Something that you see politically in, universities, and now you're seeing it just everywhere, this divisiveness. But what you're seeing now is this divisiveness in alternative researchers, and this gap is just widening, as I said. And so, I think that it's become a cult of personality, unfortunately, and people are now looking past his work and looking at it as just, this is how it is, and if you don't believe it, then forget it. And I think that's a shame, because even Sitchin would not want that. I don't believe for a minute that he would have been happy with people not questioning, because he was a serious researcher. He was very committed and very, he did a lot of justice to the topic and brought it out to the public mindset. And I don't think for a minute he would have wanted the research to stop right there. And that's sadly what's become of it, is that a lot of it has been in sort of a state of suspended animation, where it started with his book, The 12th Planet, and then he brought out subsequent books that were part of the Earth Chronicles series, and those were novels, and he was able to sort of, extend his ideas further and not be limited by the nonfiction point of view. Again, that presents problems, because people have looked at his novels and interpreted those as fact. And then, it creates this sort of muddled up picture of things. But I think that, it's what makes this book different, The Anunnaki Connection, is that I don't obediently accept all positions of traditional academia or the debunkers, but I also don't blindly accept the word of any one alternative researcher, and because I just am very concerned with that cult of personality problem that I think is a real threat to alternative research these days. And so I think scholars are different in that they want somebody to argue with them or, challenge them. But gurus seek to have followers. And so this is where I draw the line, if you will. So in the book, I definitely talk about Sitchin, and I give him the respect that he deserves, but I also allow myself to break through that a little bit and see how we can connect his theories with other existing theories that might give us a more holistic and full picture of this question altogether.
Critics of Sitchin's work say that his translations were faulty of the Sumerian texts. In your research, were they, and how accurate are other translations? I believe that a lot of his translations were correct because he did have a great deal of knowledge on these ancient languages. However, there are some that are not correct, or at least could be interpreted differently. And I really think that's where the difference is between translation and interpretation. And so the translation is one thing, but the way he interpreted things is his own. And it may not be right, and somebody else could look at that and interpret it differently. They may not be right. It's very difficult to understand who could be right in that, only because it's a qualitative attempt to understand. But as far as the just generally speaking, I would say that most of his translations were correct. There are a couple that I would disagree with, and others have disagreed with, but I talk about those in the book, and I give my particular interpretation, alternative interpretations. But that's not even to suggest that what I would be saying is correct. Again, it's all basically a question of interpretation rather than translation. So yes, I think he translated things correctly. Did he interpret everything correctly? Not 100%. My guest is Dr. Heather Lynn. She's the author of the new book, The Anunnaki Connection, Sumerian Gods, Alien DNA, and the Fate of Humanity. We'll be back with more of Heather after these words on the OMTimes Radio Network.
Ascending Hearts is no ordinary dating site, but a spiritual dating site with a purpose, to link you with your soulmate. We engineer the serendipity so you can trust that you will attune with someone that has the same matching vibration as you. Ascending Hearts, the conscious dating site for the spiritually aware. Try Ascending Hearts for free. AscendingHearts.com.
The student asks the teacher, "How do I experience transformation?" The teacher replies, "When the student is ready to receive deeper answers, the student then asks, 'How do I know what deeper questions to ask?' And the teacher replies, "When the student decides to commit to a practice inviting transformation, level 2 questions will be revealed." Hi, I'm Tomas Garza, and as a teacher and host, I'm inviting listeners to enroll in the mastery of transformation by joining me on Decide to Transform, your bridge to level 2 answers. Tuesdays, 1 p.m. Eastern on OMTimes Radio.
America, your children have an amazing superpower. That's right. They can help save lives by simply washing their hands. Just 20 seconds of thorough hand washing after they've coughed or sneezed or been outside can help fight against the dastardly spread of germs. Armed with only soap and water and hands, your superhero can protect you, your family, and everyone out there in America land. Amazing! Find out more at coronavirus.gov. A message from the CDC and the Ad Council.
Back on Destination Unlimited, my guest this week, Dr. Heather Lynn. She's the author of the new book, The Anunnaki Connection, Sumerian Gods, Alien DNA, and the Fate of Humanity. Here's a big loaded question for you, Heather. In your opinion, were the Anunnaki real?
Oh, that is a loaded question. I guess it depends on what you mean by real. And so in my mind, there is no doubt that they were real. What does that mean? Well, I think they were biological entities. I think that the text makes that pretty clear. But I think what isn't clear is the term Anunnaki. And that's something I really break down in the book, this idea that the Anunnaki is a catch-all phrase really for a number of different manifestations of gods and beings and even people in positions of power. So a lot of an example I would liken it to is the word Lord. So you could say Lord Jesus Christ or Lord Shiva or the landlord or Lord of the manor. At some point it turns into not the ultimate in Lord God, but it can be used in a general setting. And if you look at some of the ancient texts the Sumerians left behind of their kings lists, there are quite a few that show this connection between the Anunnaki of the before the flood and the kind of evolution of this king's list and their association with Anunnaki until after a while those gods seem to have left in a lot of ways out of the text, and instead of being right there on earth with the king, it's as though the king becomes the god. And you see this then happen with this divine right of kings, and they influence the way the Egyptians operate, where you have this idea that the head of the state is actually divine. And so if you kind of tear that apart and look at the texts themselves, you'll see that they had a holy trinity, much like the Christian faith, with a God that was the ultimate God of being. They had the son of that God, and they had a Holy Spirit ghost. They called them ghosts, these Anunnaki, and so they would be spiritual. They didn't have a body in a lot of ways. But then there were other Anunnaki that were clearly described as being biological beings, very human-like, and so much so that there are texts to describe what they like to eat in great detail. I include that in the book, some of the recipes they were fond of and the foods they like to have, which I thought was a kind of an important detail, because there was a clear distinction between a time where the people of Mesopotamia, before the others came, they ate limited meat. Though they were hunter-gatherers, they were semi-settled and they practiced early forms of agriculture, and their bodies weren't as tall or robust. The archaeological evidence shows that, much like many hunter-gatherer tribes, they were smaller and they didn't have the same access to meat and animal products that an agricultural group would. And then what you have is the story of these other beings coming to the region, sort of unifying and in some ways enslaving or subjugating the people, the hunter-gatherer tribes that were already there. And those beings, it was described, they would eat what the existing people, who were called the black-headed ones, they would eat what they ate, but they were never satisfied. They were always hungry and wanting more, until they ended up instructing the hunter-gatherer groups who were there to bring them animals and burn the animals as like a burnt offering. And that was and so that was the idea of the burnt offering, was actually because they wanted the food they wanted to eat. And so the Hebrew origin of the idea of worship actually means to work for. And so for them to go and work for or worship these beings by sacrificing these animals and burning their bodies for them, it sounds very, very biblical in a lot of ways, or religious. But if you look at it in this practical sense, in the way that the text describes, it's simply these beings were much more carnivorous, or they were omnivores, and they had these people subjugated and trained to bring them this meat and cook it out. And they had very specific recipes for how they wanted the food cooked. They wanted it on an open flame. They didn't want it boiled. They wanted certain animals, etc. And so here you have this evidence that these beings were human-like, or humans at least, and they were very biologically real, but that they had a belief set that also revered spirit-type beings. Now, if you look even before that, the Anunnaki described the gods that they had been in contact with before the flood, known as the seven sages. And what the texts have to say about the seven sages is quite fascinating. It's that these were semi-biological beings. And that's where it gets kind of funny. So these beings were sometimes described as looking like fish. They came out of the water. They took the form of a human during the day, and then they would disappear at night. But there's this whole notion that these particular fish-like creatures were semi-biological. There was something else about them. And so here you have the Anunnaki, this term can encompass so many different things. So when you ask, were they real? Absolutely. There was something real here going on. It's a real phenomenon, and these were real individuals, and these were real beings. But it just, it's a little more complicated than that. And I try to, hopefully, I do a decent job breaking it down in the book to describe, the realness of each group. But some of it's still a mystery.
Well, they were into burgers, so they had to have been real, right?
Exactly. They liked alcohol, too. They got drunk a lot, and they liked sugar, and they liked baked goods. And
that brings up another question then. Let's talk about that for a second. Let's say that they were an advanced Earth-based biological form. Mm-hmm. And you said the word worship is the word Lord, work for. And that these are like lords in the concept of the Lord. If these people were technologically superior or physically superior, but terrestrial based, mm-hmm. that would be the same description.
Exactly. And that's a little bit, where I venture in the book really is that I describe all the texts that would point to that. And there's definite evidence in the archaeological and historical records that the Anunnaki were a group of advanced living beings, human beings, who settled in a mountain valley in the Near East around 8200 BCE. And that's an important time period because that is around the time of the Younger Dryas, where you have this near extinction event, possibly triggered by a meteor, that would have displaced these people. And it really comes down to this Noah's Ark tale, which you can find earlier than Noah's Ark, the one that we're familiar with, but it goes all the way to Sumerian text and probably before in the form of oral tradition. Mm-hmm. But what's different when you really look at the original text for this, it describes not a family per se, not a family and not an ark that carried every single animal, but instead it really describes displaced scholars and scientists. It makes it a point to say that the people that were able to escape this flood that was triggered by this near extinction event and the melting of the ice, that they brought with them the most skilled people because they were looking to have a breakaway civilization. And they only had so many people that could go. And in terms of the animals, the text actually says not that they took every animal or two of each kind or whatnot, but it says they took with them the animals of the steppe, which in the context meant the animals that they kept domesticated so that they could have them for food and as needed. So if you imagine the scenario where there's these high-tech beings who, knew that there was this extinction event coming or near extinction event, and they got the best and the brightest to come along and as many animals as they could and that they needed for survival, and they started traveling. And they settled then in this area in Mesopotamia, where they encountered bands of hunter-gatherers who they described as having black hair. They described them as the Adama, or the red people. And, what's fascinating to me is the description. If these people who came from this northern area, if they didn't have black hair, why it would make sense that they would point to the people that were in this Mesopotamian region as having black hair because it's a distinguishing feature. So it would indicate that they did not, that somehow they looked differently. And the Sumerians at the time, when they wrote about these gods coming, they described them as very large. Well, the people in Mesopotamia beforehand, given their differences in nutrition and availability, they would have been much smaller and 5 foot. And the people, if they would have had the people that came, the people from the north, the visitors, if they had this high technology and they already had domesticated animals and agriculture, they would have been a lot more robust. And that could have meant they were 6 foot, which could be very intimidating.
And so they might have been blonde and blue-eyed, Nordic-looking, which a lot of people say the Pleiadian aliens look like.
And that is what's fascinating, too, because if you consider these beings coming down and sort of, having these people work for them and having the Garden of Eden and these stories, what it doesn't take into account, but is what was their belief set? Where did they get their technology or their ideas? And you see breadcrumbs of this throughout the text, that they are the ones who describe the sages that they prayed to. And those 7 sages are actually linked to the Pleiades, the Pleiadian star system. So when they depict them in their astronomical calendars, they show the 7 sages, the pre-flood gods, who are also considered Anunnaki. They show them as the 7 stars of the Pleiades.
Wonderful.
That's where they say they got their high technology that they brought with them and shared with the people of Mesopotamia. And in a blink of an eye, historically, in about 200 years, you go from loosely banded groups of hunter-gatherers to one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known.
And again, the missing link, maybe.
Maybe.
My guest is Dr. Heather Lynn. She's the author of the new book, The Anunnaki Connection, Sumerian Gods, Alien DNA, and the Fate of Humanity. Heather, one more time, please tell our listeners where they can get your book and find out more about you and this amazing work.
You can find me at my website, drheatherlynn.com. That's drheatherlynn.com. And you can get my books at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, indie bookstores, wherever books are sold. And you can email me too at heather@drheatherlynn.com if you have any suggestions for research or questions thereafter. I'd be glad to help anyone with their research endeavors as well.
And Heather, as we discussed earlier, we are living through history right now, big history, and we're going to talk more about this. You will be back.
Indeed.
And thank you for joining us on Destination Unlimited. I'm Victor the Voice Fuhrman. Have a wonderful week.